So we're here today at the lovely and picturesque Royal Perth Yacht Club to hear a presentation that's been hosted by the Council for National Interest. The presenter today is Adam Creighton, the economics editor of The Australian, and he's going to present a number of points that he's raised and published about extensively that he believes will help to fix Australia. So we're here today with Adam Creighton, the economics editor of The Australian, and we've just listened to your presentation covering a variety of very far-reaching topics and mostly focusing on policy. Yep. Now, one of the things you came out swinging against in particular was superannuation, and I think given the Hayne Royal Commission and a bunch of other things, a lot of people are a bit unhappy with how that system is structured. But you also mentioned that there would be some massive roadblocks to changing anything. So if you were to pick another piece of legislation that might be easier to implement that would have some really great benefits for Australia, what would that be?
Well, I think the government's got some pretty good ideas now about capping fees. So there is some legislation to cap fees at 3%, but like I was saying in my talk, 3% is a bit of a joke. So if it was 1% or 2%, that would save people real money. And I think it would also be very popular because people could see that many people are overcharged and that there should be a cap in a compulsory system. So that would be one way, I think, to improve the system. The other way that I talked about was also to have some sort of default fund, maybe overseen by the government or maybe auctioned out to a cheap fund manager, where people who don't want to who don't want to choose their fund, basically will be put automatically into a low-cost fund, which will leave them far better off in 30 or 40 years when they retire.
The other thing that you mentioned was the Japanification. Now that's something that I don't think gets nearly enough attention because well done. So I mean, in many respects, the Japanese economy is a few years ahead of us in terms of their deep dive into quantitative easing and the aging population, which is a massive issue, and it's going to be a massive issue here. And that's obviously had all sorts of implications, especially in their property market, where, in a lot of areas in Japan, they're actually giving properties away now because there's simply no one to live in them. Is that something you think could happen here?
Well, probably not, because we have such strong population growth in Australia, and that's not through natural birth necessarily, but through huge immigration. Now, to my mind, Japan doesn't have that. The population's shrinking, so I don't think we're ever going to experience that in Australia, because the desire to live here is just so great that I don't think a government, would or even could ever stop large numbers of people wanting to come here and coming here. So I don't think we'll face that problem, but certainly on the financial side, just as you point out, I mean, Japan has had zero rates since 2001, and a lot of people forget that. They think, it's all since the financial crisis. Actually, no, Japan's been doing this a long time. And also quantitative easing, they've done it in a far more extreme way than the US has. I mean, the balance sheet of the Japanese central bank is, I think, more than 100% of Japan's GDP. It's just extraordinary figures. They've basically bought up about half of the government debt that is outstanding with new money. Now, the interesting point about all this is if you ask the average Japanese what they think the inflation rate is in Japan, they actually say 4%. I just looked this up recently, and it just shocked me. Yeah. So clearly they're not paying any attention, at least ordinary Japanese are not paying any attention to quantitative easing.
Yeah. So, it's really started to enter the public psyche in this country now that, we are carrying a vast amount of debt as a function of our disposable income. What's gotten a lot less attention is that the asset side of the household balance sheet is actually looking really good. So now the question is, how vulnerable do you think the asset side of the balance sheet is, though?
Well, look, I think it is vulnerable. If there were a sudden kind of geopolitical event, like a massive escalation of the trade war, if something bad happened in China, I think we would really feel a sudden shock. The currency could fall a lot. There could be a loss of confidence in Sydney and Melbourne house prices, also Perth house prices. They are very high compared to other countries. So I think the likely scenario is that they stay high and they maybe continue to increase again, but certainly you couldn't rule out like a sudden drop if there were some event overseas which triggered it.
Sure. And if you could choose one important piece of guidance to offer to the average Australian household, what do you think that would be?
Certainly to shift their superannuation money to a cheap fund. That is the best possible thing they could do for their financial future.
Thank you. I'm now here with
Ken Schultz.
And what do you want to tell us, Ken?
I just found it very interesting today, and I asked Adam particularly a question about comparing our superannuation system to the Singapore system, which I thought is very good, having spoken to a number of Singaporeans. So I put it to him to see what he thought about that.
Just an interested member of the public, really. Yes.
And what would you like to tell us about today, Julian?
Well, I was very impressed with Adam. I think it was a very, very good speech. There are two things that came over to me which I thought were very logical and worth following up. The first was nuclear energy. That makes a lot of sense to me. And the second was some modest form of inheritance tax. I would like to see that followed through. It's a pity we don't have it. I think it's a very, very fair tax and something that we should be able to implement.
It certainly does a lot to remove some of those big concentrations of wealth that have built up in quite a few economies over the past few decades. So thank you very much for talking to us today, Julian. And this is Richard Gordon with Undercurrent.